Good evening, peasants. I am your host, Miso. Tonight I ask you to put down your cups of tea, pull your vehicles to the side of the road, and listen very carefully to a story of magnificent human pettiness. When you grip the leather steering wheel of a perfectly aged A5, or perhaps when you gaze upon a flawlessly engineered German engine block, you assume this brand was built on cold, calculating logic. You picture polite men in pristine white lab coats, shaking hands over blueprints. Let me completely shatter that adorable illusion for you. The birth of this high-performance dynasty did not begin with a handshake. It began with a spectacularly embarrassing temper tantrum. In the year 1899, an aggressively brilliant German engineer named August Horch founded his very own car company. He named it, rather unimaginatively, Horch and Zieh. Now, August was an absolute mechanical genius, but like many humans who prefer the company of gears over people, he possessed the interpersonal skills of a cornered badger. He was a ruthless perfectionist. He yelled at his financial officers, he ignored his board of directors, and he absolutely refused to compromise on his outrageously expensive engineering designs. The accountants were terrified. The investors were losing their minds. So in 1909, his own business partners did the utterly unthinkable. They called a meeting, and they fired him. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated humiliation. You build an entire company from the ground up, you paint your own surname on the factory gates, and 10 years later, a group of men in cheap suits politely asks you to clear out your desk and leave the premises. Now, what does a furious, rejected mechanical genius do? He immediately walks across town, rents a new factory, and starts a second car company. And he names it August Horch Automobilwerke. Brilliant, inspired, and completely catastrophically illegal. His former partners, the accountants and the board members, immediately sued him for trademark infringement. And human courts, being the tedious bureaucratic nightmares that they are, ruled against him in Leipzig. They declared that Horch was now a registered trademark belonging to the original company. August Horch was legally, formally forbidden from using his own birth name to build his own cars. It is utterly ridiculous. Imagine telling an apex predator he can no longer call himself an otter because a group of men in cheap suits copyrighted the word. It defies the laws of nature. Defeated, Horch arranged a crisis meeting at the apartment of his close business friend Franz Fickentscher in Zwickau. These grown men, these titans of German industry, sat in a smoky room, hopelessly throwing around terrible names for the new company. In the corner of that very room, Franz's young son, Heinrich, was quietly suffering through his Latin homework. He was listening to the adults argue. Now, in German, the word Horch translates to the imperative verb hark, or listen. The boy, probably entirely bored by the adults complaining, looked up from his textbook and suggested they simply translate the name into Latin. And what is the Latin imperative form of listen? Audi. It amuses me profoundly, dear listeners. When you look at the aggressive, menacing badge on the front of a modern performance vehicle, a machine literally designed to devour the autobahn, you are looking at a name that was essentially born from a 10-year-old child's grammar assignment. They loved it. In April 1910, Audi Automobilwerke was officially registered. The crisis was averted. But naming a company is simply words on a page. Surviving the total collapse of the global economy is an entirely different matter. Please, listeners, secure your wallets. We have arrived at the year 1929. The American stock market had just catastrophically collapsed, plunging the entire globe into the Great Depression. In Germany, the economic devastation was absolute. People were struggling to afford bread, and shockingly, when humans are starving, they're not particularly interested in purchasing magnificent handcrafted six-cylinder luxury automobiles. The entire German automotive industry was bleeding to death. Our dear friend August Horch and his newly named Audi company were staring directly into the abyss of bankruptcy. But he was not alone. There were 3 other struggling automotive prey in the region of Saxony, DKW, which made terrible little 2-stroke motorcycles, Wanderer, which made incredibly boring mid-size cars, and, hilariously, the original Horch company, the very same men in cheap suits who had fired August Horch years earlier. Enter the ultimate apex predator of the human world, the bank. Specifically, the State Bank of Saxony. They looked at these 4 dying companies and issued a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. They forced them into a corporate marriage. In June 1932, Audi, DKW, Horch, and Wanderer were chained together to form a brand new syndicate called Auto Union AG. They needed a logo to represent this forced alliance. Now, human marketing departments love to romanticize this. They designed 4 interlocking silver rings. Today, you look at those rings on the grille of an Audi, and you think of Olympic glory, unity, and unbroken prestige. But let me assure you, dear listeners, it was not a romantic union. It was 4 drowning men clinging to the exact same piece of floating wood so they wouldn't sink to the bottom of the financial ocean. And the most utterly exquisite irony? August Horch, the man who was legally banned from using his own name, was now forced to sit on the board of directors of Auto Union, right across the table from the men of Horch who had sued him. The tension in that boardroom must have been magnificent. But they survived. And to prove their dominance to the world, they decided they needed to build a racing car. Not just a car, a monster. The newly formed Auto Union Syndicate needed to prove to the world and, specifically, to their arrogant rivals at Mercedes-Benz that they were not just a collection of bankrupt businessmen. They needed to dominate the Grand Prix. To do this, they hired an absolute mad scientist of an engineer named Ferdinand Porsche. Now, human engineers in the 1930s usually put the engine at the front of the car, where it belonged. But Herr Porsche? No. He possessed a beautifully homicidal level of genius. He took a massive, heavy, terrifyingly powerful 16-cylinder engine and shoved it directly behind the driver's head. This created a mid-engine layout. Today you see this on modern supercars like the Audi R8. But in 1934, with skinny, pathetic tyres that looked like they belonged on a bicycle and a primitive swing-axle suspension, it was a recipe for absolute catastrophe. These beautiful unpainted aluminum monsters were called the Silver Arrows. The Auto Union Type C produced over 500 horsepower. It was so nose-light and so violently tail-heavy that if a driver pressed the throttle a millimetre too hard, the car would instantly spin out and attempt to eliminate them. It is utterly magnificent. As an apex predator, I respect a machine that requires actual dominance to survive. Most normal human drivers were completely terrified of it. It required a specific breed of lunatic. Enter Bernd Rose-Meyer, a fearless former motorcycle racer who didn't know enough about cars to be afraid of them. He climbed into this V16 death trap, grabbed it by the scruff of its mechanical neck, and drove it to multiple championships, completely humiliating Mercedes. Auto Union had conquered the racetrack. They had built a masterpiece of mechanical violence, but unfortunately, the darkest chapter of human history was about to begin. The Second World War arrived, and bombs do not respect racing trophies. You see, the magnificent factories of Audi, DKW, Horch, and Wanderer were all located in the state of Saxony. And unfortunately for our brilliant German engineers, Saxony fell directly into the Soviet occupation zone. I understand territorial conquest. When a larger bear enters the river, it takes all the salmon. The Soviet military administration did exactly that. They did not just take control of the factories, they completely dismantled them. They unbolted the heavy machinery, they took the blueprints, they probably took the incredibly uncomfortable boardroom chairs. They packed the entire automotive empire onto freight trains and shipped it all back to the Soviet Union as war reparations. It is, quite frankly, the most magnificent large-scale industrial burglary in human history. But physical theft was not enough. In 1948, the Soviet bureaucrats marched into the registry offices in Chemnitz, opened the commercial register, and literally crossed the name Auto Union AG off the books. They deleted it. Legally, officially, and structurally, the company that built the terrifying V16 Silver Arrows ceased to exist. Poof, gone, like a weak gazelle in the tall grass. So what happened to the men in the cheap suits? The executives like Richard Brune and Dr. Karl Hahn, alongside a handful of desperate engineers, packed their bags and fled the Soviet zone like frightened prey in the night. They traveled south to the American occupation zone, to a quiet Bavarian town called Ingolstadt. They had no factories, they had no money, they had absolutely no dignity left. They set up shop in freezing, drafty former military buildings, simply selling spare parts to survive. It was a spectacular fall from grace, from dominating the Grand Prix to rummaging through dusty boxes of old spark plugs in a Bavarian shed. But survival requires desperate measures. To survive the post-war economy, they needed to actually sell cars. But nobody in a destroyed Europe could afford a massive, luxurious Horch or an Audi. So they were forced to resurrect the cheapest, most undignified brand of their four rings, DKW. DKW specialized in front-wheel drive cars with two-stroke engines. Models like the DKW F89 and the hilariously named 3 = 6. Now, for those of you who appreciate refined engineering, a two-stroke engine is an absolute crime against nature. Instead of having a proper oil system, you literally have to pour lubricating oil directly into the fuel tank, like a peasant mixing a crude potion. As a creature of pristine rivers, I find the result personally offensive. When you started one of these cars, it sounded exactly like a highly agitated lawnmower. Ring, ding, ding, ding. And worse, the exhaust pipe would violently vomit a thick, noxious plume of bright blue smoke directly into the faces of everyone behind you. Imagine it. The men who once engineered the Silver Arrows, the men who challenged the gods of the Grand Prix, were now surviving by selling little metal boxes that smelled like a chemical fire in a plastics factory. It is utterly humiliating. But, tragically, it worked. The blue smoke cars sold well during the early desperate years of the German economic miracle. They kept the company alive. But eventually, The humans of West Germany got richer. They wanted proper cars, four-stroke engines. The blue smoke was no longer a symbol of affordable mobility. It was a smelly embarrassment. It is 1958. Auto Union is drowning in its own blue two-stroke smoke. Sales are plummeting. The company is once again on the verge of financial evaporation. And who swoops down from the aristocratic heavens to purchase them? Daimler-Benz. Yes, listeners, Mercedes-Benz, the very company Auto Union was built to humiliate on the Grand Prix tracks of the 1930s, bought them for a massive sum of money. It was the ultimate humiliation. The mighty Mercedes essentially bought their old rival just to keep them as a miserable little pet in Ingolstadt. But Mercedes did do one utterly brilliant thing. They realized the two-stroke engines were an embarrassment to humanity. So they sent one of their most brilliant engineers, a man named Ludwig Krauss, to Auto Union. His strict orders were to throw the blue smoke engines in the river and design a proper modern four-stroke engine, and Krauss did exactly that. But here is where the apex predator made a fatal, historically hilarious miscalculation. By 1964, Mercedes was bored. Auto Union was still losing money. Mercedes looked at this company, deemed it a complete failure, and decided to throw it in the rubbish bin. They sold Auto Union to Volkswagen. Now, Volkswagen didn't want a luxury brand. They just desperately needed more factory space to build their adorable, painfully slow little Beetles. But Mercedes made a catastrophic error. When they sold the factories to Volkswagen, they accidentally left behind Ludwig Krauss and the nearly completed, highly advanced four-stroke engine he had designed with Mercedes's own money. Volkswagen bought an empty factory, and completely by accident they inherited the technological foundation of modern Audi. Mercedes literally handed their greatest future rival the exact weapon needed to defeat them. It's crazy just to think about it. It is the late 1960s and 1970s. Volkswagen now owns Audi. But the dull, unimaginative bureaucrats at VW gave their new engineers a strict, humiliating order. You are just a glorified assembly line for our Beetles. Do not design any new cars. Stop thinking. Now, telling a brilliant German engineer to stop thinking is like telling an otter to stop swimming. It is biologically impossible. So, Ludwig Krauss and a ruthless young visionary named Ferdinand Piëch simply ignored them. They began developing entirely new, incredibly sleek cars like the Audi 100 in absolute terrifying secrecy. They hid the blueprints. They worked in the shadows. When the VW executives finally discovered the car, it was already so undeniably brilliant that they were forced to put it into production. But the true magnificent rebellion happened in the snow. In 1977, an Audi chassis engineer named Jörg Benzinger was in the freezing forests of Finland testing the VW Iltis. The Iltis was a slow, incredibly ugly military jeep. It looked like a metal brick. But Benzinger noticed something astounding. Because it had four-wheel drive, this pathetic little brick was completely outperforming magnificent, powerful rear-wheel drive sports cars in the snow. I understand the value of claws. Power is completely useless if you cannot grip the earth. Benzinger rushed back to Ferdinand Piëch and said, "We must put this military four-wheel drive system into a high-performance passenger car." Again, they did this in secret. Project EA262. They took the elegant body of an Audi 80, shoved a modified military drivetrain underneath it, and gave it a turbocharged 5-cylinder engine. In 1980, they unveiled it to the world. They called it the Quattro, and they took it to the World Rally Championship. It was an absolute massacre. The Quattro completely, utterly destroyed the competition. It rewrote the laws of physics. While the other rear-wheel drive cars were sliding helplessly in the mud like drunken penguins, the Quattro simply gripped the earth and vanished into the distance. The rebellious engineers had won. Audi was no longer a smoky joke. They were technological gods. After the Quattro destroyed the rally world, Audi realized something profound. Why simply build good cars when you can build technological assassins? Under Ferdinand Piëch, they became obsessed with the details. Panel gaps so perfectly tight you couldn't slide a single whisker between them. Aluminum space frames that made the cars as light and rigid as a predator's skeleton. They began building monsters, but they hid them inside practical German clothing. Take the 1994 RS2 Avant, for example. They collaborated with Porsche to build a station wagon, a family car designed for groceries and dogs that could accelerate from 0 to 30 faster than a McLaren F1 supercar. It is a level of psychological deception that I find deeply, profoundly romantic. But the true declaration of war came in 2006. Audi looked at Ferrari and Lamborghini, and they released the R8. They essentially took Italian supercar DNA, removed all the electrical fires and unreliability, and wrapped it in a perfectly tailored, sensible German suit. It was the vehicular equivalent of a sniper rifle. And so we reach my final verdict on the Four Rings, a company founded on a petty temper tantrum, legally erased by a child's Latin homework, forced into a desperate marriage by a bank, hijacked by the Soviets, choked by blue two-stroke smoke, tossed into the rubbish bin by Mercedes-Benz, and ultimately saved by a midnight rebellion in the snow. It is a completely, utterly absurd history, but they refuse to die. And today, they rule the Autobahn. Drive fast, dress well, never let them see you sweat. Now, before you flood the comment section begging me to talk about the history of BMW or Mercedes, save your breath. I will never make a video about them. Why? Because I simply do not care for them. They lack soul. While you humans argue over which oversized grille looks less ridiculous, I have my 2016 Audi A5 to polish. I do not have the time nor the palate for anything less than 4 rings of perfection. Take your requests elsewhere. I am busy. Cheerio.